Everyone, today's mini lesson is going to continue the conversation from yesterday on the core ideals of American society as expressed through various primary documents. Today's mini lesson is going to focus on the Constitution. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Constitution was actually the second legal law of the land created for the United States. Directly following the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers created the initial draft of the Constitution known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was meant to create a alliance between the 13 states and create a new system of government for the new country, which emphasized power at the state level. The problems they ran into was that there was no president, so there was no ultimate person in charge of the country. There was no way for the legislative branch to easily pass laws because it required 9 out of 13 states to agree. And at the time, especially with the separation between the North and the South, there wasn't a lot of agreement happening. There was not a Supreme Court system to enforce the laws that were being created. There was not a way to require states to send members to become a part of the military. There was not a formal way to collect taxes. Consequently, the Founding Fathers started discussing about amending or changing the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, in these conversations, which began in the late 1780s, they determined instead of fixing the Articles of Confederation to create a new document known as the Constitution. In 1789, the Constitution was formally ratified and created the law of the land as we know it today. The learning target for this lesson is very similar to the learning target that was referenced in the last lesson. However, instead of focusing on the Declaration of Independence, we are now going to look at the Constitution. The learning target states, I can identify core ideals of American society as reflected in the Constitution. In the previous lesson, we talked about how the Declaration of Independence emphasizes a lot of the major themes within American society today. This included ideas about equality and all men being created equal, liberty and how that is an inalienable right, which often references freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, which is another inalienable right, which is talking about personal fulfillment and betterment of socioeconomic classes. Within the Constitution, we're going to specifically focus on the ideals of having a limited government and equality. We're also going to talk a little bit about how the interpretation of the Constitution has evolved over time. So, the first thing we're going to look at is limited government. Limited government was a major concern of the Founding Fathers, especially following the Revolutionary War. They had literally gone to war because they felt that King George III had become too powerful. He was enforcing taxes that they didn't feel they should have to pay for the French and Indian War. He was not allowing representation from the colonies. He was, in their words, not allowing trade to happen with other countries. He was limiting the justice in terms of the court system. Now, as we know, all of those responsibilities actually come down to Parliament, but in the Declaration of Independence, King George III was blamed for those things happening. When the Founding Fathers got together to discuss the changes to the Articles of Confederation, they knew that they needed to create a larger government. So, under the Articles of Confederation, a large majority of the responsibility fell on the states. This created 13 individual states instead of a united country. When they created a federal government, they wanted to make sure that while they were increasing the responsibilities of the federal government, that there was still limitations on their power so that they were not in the same boat as they were under King George III in Great Britain. This led to the development of a system known as the separation of powers. The intention of the separation of powers was to create three different branches of government that worked individually and worked together. In the Constitution, it spells out the roles and responsibilities of each of these branches, including who can become a part of each of these branches. The Article 1 of the Constitution talks about the legislative branch and lays out the roles and responsibilities for the House of Representatives and the Senate. Article 2 talks about the executive branch and the responsibilities of the president, vice president, and the president's cabinet. And Article 3 talks about the judicial branch, which is focusing on the Supreme Court and other federal courts. In addition to having individual responsibilities, there is also a system of checks and balances to ensure that everyone is doing their role and that no one is becoming too powerful. For example, In order for a judge to become a part of the Supreme Court, they need to be named by the president and approved by the Senate. So, this is an example of a check and balance that actually influences all the branches. Other examples of checks and balances include things like the presidential veto or the impeachment trials. The goal of limited government is to aim to prevent tyranny, similar to what the colonists would have experienced under Great Britain. The second thing we're going to talk about is equality. Equality is not directly addressed in the initial Constitution. However, the 14th Amendment greatly references this concept of equality as it is extending the equal protection under the Constitution. Under the 14th Amendment, it states that individuals are protected as citizens of the United States regardless of race, gender, and background. So, this is greatly expanding the section of the population that is protected under the federal law of the land, unlike what was initially prescribed under the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the initial Constitution. So, at this point in history, we start to see an expansion of rights to other races, to women, and to other groups within the population. So, over time, the Constitution has been an evolving document. This has been a constant debate at various levels of government as to how much the Constitution should be able to change over time. However, the Founding Fathers acknowledged that there would be needed to be changes in the interpretation of the Constitution as new things were coming up as concerns that they couldn't have possibly considered at the time. We have especially seen this with the need of increased security within the country as well as an expansion in technology. So there has been a lot of changes in terms of the interpretations of these core ideals of American society. For example, there have been changes in the interpretation of individual rights, which are mainly directed at some of the amendments to the Constitution. Equality, as different social movements are rising up, such as the abolitionist movement, which ended slavery, or the women's rights movement, which initially fought for the women's right to vote, or the civil rights movement, which extended the rights of African Americans, or same sex marriage. There's lots of different examples of different groups throughout history that have fought through equality and fought for the extension of protection under the Constitution for various groups. In addition, there have been different conversations about the role of government. There have been debates about whether the federal government should only be able to do the responsibilities specifically stated in the Constitution, or if there is some means of interpretation. Over time, they have found that there are some room for kind of wiggle room in terms of interpreting the Constitution and doing what they need to do in order to create the country the way that it is today. So, throughout this lesson, you'll see kind of this repetition in terms of themes. So, already we've seen equality reference both within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. However, as we continue on throughout the school year, you will also see continued conversation based around limited government.